Chapter 7, The First Sudden Shock. You probably guessed by now, but we are on to another year. So now I'm 20 and a year into uni. Now, if you've been on my website before and you've read my entries, you would see and you would have read that uni for me was particularly difficult. And this was a particularly difficult and very traumatic time for me. And if you haven't, then why not? Of course, I'm joking. I don't expect anyone to have read everything on my website and have read all of my writing. But we can just say that it definitely wasn't a pleasant experience for me in the slightest. So at this point, I was on edge anyway, and my meerkats that I've spoken of before in my earlier chapters, well, they were now an army of meerkats standing to attention. And they were on full alert. They were ready. And it wasn't just for death this time, though of course they were on alert for that. They were also on alert for the overwhelming busyness that uni felt like. The crowds, the tall building, the noise, the panic. I was on edge that something might happen. I was on edge that something might happen to me. But there were still those fair few in the regiment ready and on alert for that phone call, that text, that somebody sitting me down and telling me that somebody else within my circle, within my family, within my friends had died. But because, as I said, I also had the meerkats that were really busy being on alert during my time in uni at this point, I had put the grief for all the other funerals that I'd been to before by this point. Of course, if you remember from the last chapter, we're now on to... We were on to nine funerals. So because of, as I said, my uni experience at this point, that grief had been put on hold. And I was so caught up in this uni experience for all the negative reasons that I found it to be, that I naively let my guard down. I let those meerkats in that regiment that were looking out for somebody else to go to the back of the army, go to the back of the queue, whatever you want to call it, and kind of have a rest. And kind of go, okay, you don't have to be on alert as much, it'll be all right. But as ever, that didn't last long. Because once again, it wasn't long before death had caught up to me and my family and friends. It was autumn, I remember that, because the evenings were dark, the leaves were falling and the air was damp. My family and I had gone to a well-known chain pub that does Sunday dinners. And I still remember it really, really vividly. It's still very clear in my mind. The busy dining area, the dark evenings, the feeling of dread to go back to another lecture that was happening the next day. Now, before I carry on with this memory that's really vivid in my mind, even now, talking about it all these years later, it brings me to another reflection. When you've been through grief that feels particularly traumatic, you'll most likely go back to that exact moment even years later. And this again brings me to the word compassion. Because you're not expected to suddenly never go back to those moments, that feeling, those images, even if it has been years later. Now, of course, I, as somebody who's an advocate of mental health and making sure that you reach out for help no matter your gender, Um, and all of that stuff, and especially if you're a male, to reach out for help is so important, because it's still this stigma that men shouldn't, and men should just carry on, and that's not how it should be. You should always reach out for help. So if those flashbacks are really intense still, and it has been years later, and they are stopping you from doing everyday things, then of course seek therapy, because then you can be given tools to manage those flashbacks. And I know from the various therapies I've had through the years, that has definitely helped with that. However, and it is a however, you can never, and you should never be expected to get over it, the grief, even years later. So those flashbacks will still come, but hopefully not be as intense if you've reached out to therapy, if you need that, or even if you just talk to somebody that's close to you. That sometimes helps. Or journal, whatever it might be, again, as long as you're not hurting yourself or those around you. Now, back to that autumn evening. So, it was dark, the air was damp, we were all sitting in the cozy pub, eating our Sunday dinners, and suddenly my dad's phone rang and he picked it up. Nothing unusual. At least we all thought anyway. You know, dad getting a phone call. People get phone calls all the time. And even though I say it was nothing unusual, those meerkats that were sleeping, that were in that, retreat, that having a rest, they slowly started to stir and they started to sense something. And I felt myself, when I think back to that time and that place, and I can vividly be there, and I'm closing my eyes now and I'm there, I'm in that building, I'm in those feelings. I know now the meerkats were starting to come out of their hibernation. They knew something was not right about this phone call. And within a few seconds, it was very clear, because my dad's face changed once the person on the other end of the phone started to speak to him. And he uttered the words that the meerkats were now scanning for. And his face was just full of disbelief. This individual was another member of the group. They were a parent. They were a friend. They were somebody that supported me in school as a staff member. They were somebody that knew my parents for many years. They had so much life ahead of them that it made it feel even more cruel. I remember my mum clasping her hands over her mouth. My dad paid the bill and we all left the restaurant and went to the car, and it all felt so sudden. We were all in such utter shock. And then as we found out, the way it happened was so awful. So myself and my brother, we went back home, and my parents went round to the person's house who had passed away to be with close friends who were there. And this was the first, and really sadly not the last, cruel, sudden, out of the blue, didn't make any sense, no one was expecting it, incredibly traumatic death. It felt so wicked, because for the first time, death came out of absolutely nowhere. There was no, they were given a limited time. It just felt really swift and really unjust. And I remember being in absolute utter disbelief. And I was trying to make sense of why. I was trying to work out why. And this is something that brings us to another reflection, because when we lose somebody close to us, when you're on this journey, and if you're on this journey now, whilst you're listening to this, and I'm hoping that these, as I said in chapters before, and I'll say continually throughout this audiobook, I'm hoping this gives you some comfort. on the journey you're on. And everybody's journey is unique when it comes to grief. But I'm hoping you resonate with this in some way along this journey with me. But often we ask the why. And when we've lost somebody, we ask that a lot. We ask why them? Why in that way? Why at that age? Why can't they stay with us longer? There's so many whys that go through our head. And I do this less now because, again, I've had a lot of therapy through the years. I've talked to a lot of close people around me when people have passed, and I've become a bit older, which does change your way of thinking a little bit. So I don't ask why as much, but I still ask why. I still do ask why. And asking why is a valid and it's a just part of grief. It's to be expected. It's human nature to ask why. It's human nature to try to understand because it feels so incomprehensible all the time. And if it's very sudden and swift like this particular death was, that why is very, very powerful. But what we can't do, we can't let this drive us to despair, because sometimes, as much as it's painful and heartbreaking, we have to just be at peace with never knowing the why. Sometimes we're never going to understand the why, we're never going to know the why. And I'm not saying this is something that this is easy to do and you can just do it, because it takes time and it takes a lot of exploring and a lot of going through those waves of grief to kind of have the why lesson. And as I said, the why doesn't go, the why is still there, but the why is less powerful. So this was my first experience of that sudden, out of the blue death. And it was somebody, as I said, that was very close to us in our family. And I want to say, and I wish I could say, it was not the last sudden out of the blue, but unfortunately it was. And though it's cliche and you hear it a lot, it made me realize that actually you don't know what the next day brings. And it is that thing of cherishing each day. And that doesn't mean to say that you have to go out each day out of your front door all happy and skipping and what a lovely day and oh, look at these lovely flowers and be very sort of joyous all the time, because that's not possible. We're human beings. We are allowed to feel all the emotions we feel, and some days that is just not possible. But as much as possible, to cherish the moments you have with the people you love. And even though sometimes it's hard to do and sometimes it's not possible, as much as possible to never, as cliche as it sounds, go to sleep on an argument, and to try and rectify where you can. And I think that's what grief does to you as well. It does make you readjust. It does make you think of things differently. So this was another short chapter. This was another brief chapter, because that's what it felt like in this moment when this person had died. It wasn't drawn out. It wasn't long. It was swift. It was sudden. It was incomprehensible to me at that age.